learn stuff. Yeah.
Hi, this is Greg, and I'm going to run you through a crash course in InDesign. It's going to take very little time to get you up and running and creating some great layouts and projects in Adobe InDesign. Before we begin, we need to make some changes to the setup of the software. This is particularly important if it's the first time you've launched the software on the computer you're working on. And you can't make these changes if any projects are open already. So you can see I've got an untitled project here. You're going to want to shut that down, or any projects you have open, so that you have no projects open before you can make this change. So let's go to the Edit menu and Preferences. And under Preferences, you'll find Units and Increments. So choose Units and Increments, and then here make sure that your horizontal and vertical ruler units say inches decimal. The default is picas, but we want inches decimal for both. Everything else can stay the same, and say OK to that. The result is that any projects will be displayed with rulers showing their dimensions in inches. So all measurements are referenced to inches, which is great for going to print because all your paper stocks are done in inches. So let's go File, New, so we can go forward together. New document. And you can see here that the intent is set to print. We're going to leave that as is, but there is the option to say I'm going to intend to go to the web with my layout, maybe as a background for your web page, or digital publishing, which we could talk about in a different video. So our intention is to go to print, actual hard copies of your work. So we'll leave that there. We're going to choose number of pages 4 for now, just so that we can really understand how pages work in InDesign. We're going to leave facing pages turned on. It's default, but it's important to realize that it is important to have it on if you want left and right pages. Page size is letter, and the width is 8.5 by 11. You don't have to choose a paper size from this list. You can create your own custom size, whatever you want it to be. Doesn't matter at all. But we are going to stick with the standard letter size. Okay? So let's say OK to that, and let's have a look. To have a look at the whole 4 pages of our project, let's zoom out. Hold the Control key down in your keyboard, Control key, CTRL, and press the minus key 2 or 3 times. And what you're seeing here is a spread view of the whole layout of all of your pages in one shot. That would be the cover page, if you think of it that way. Page 2 and 3 are facing pages, left and right facing pages. And the 4th page is positioned here as the back cover, if you think of it like a booklet or a magazine. Okay, let's zoom back in. Control plus plus. Since we're navigating around here, it's good to show one more tip for navigating around this space. Whenever you're on the selection tool, which is the default right now, but we won't always be on it, so be aware that you have to be on the selection tool, this black pointer sort of thing here. If that is the tool you've selected, and you press and hold the space bar down on the keyboard, a little hand will appear. When the hand appears, you can click and hold your mouse key down, and you can push around in your layout with the little hand. Let's position ourselves with page 2 and 3, the facing pages, in our viewable area, and let go of the spacebar. Okay, let's talk about the interface of Adobe InDesign, the layout of all the different parts and sections of the software. On the left side, you've got a toolbar. On the right side, you've got the palettes. The palettes can open up when you click on them and close when you click on them again. It's very common in a lot of Adobe softwares to have these palettes on the right. Across the very top, you've got the usual Windows menu items: File, Edit, View, Window, Help, the usual. We're used to these. Right below it, you've got the Control palette. That's often called the Control palette. And these options in the Control palette will change if you switch to the Type tool, for example. You can see a lot of content here that's related to word processing. And back to the Selection tool, you see content here for objects, their width, their height, their X and Y position on the page, and a lot of other options as well. When you switch to the type tool, you have the option here for character formatting controls and paragraph formatting controls. So by switching between these two buttons, you can access character options and paragraph formatting options. So that's where we're going to go now. We're going to start working on text and type formatting, and for that we need the type tool. So we're on the type tool, and we're going to stay on this A button here, the character formatting options, and we're going to bring in our first chunk of text. So make sure you've downloaded the materials pack for this video. It's called InDesign Materials 1, and in that folder you'll find a couple graphics that we'll be using, some photographs, some images, and a Bruce Lee story in Word format. So open up this Word document, and we'll bring this text into InDesign and start working with it. So here we are in Word. We want to copy the entire story. So let's make sure we know what that means. This is the heading, of course, or the title, the article. This is the byline, and this is called the deck. The deck is an introductory paragraph of sorts, or a sentence, in this case written by the editor, but not always written by the editor. And it just lets you get a sense of what you will be reading, a preview of sorts. It's not always done, but it's very common. After that, with the word after, is the beginning of the actual main body story, the main body copy that we're going to use. So we're going to select all of this. Make sure you don't just select a portion of it. Always select the entire story or chapter or section. Select it all, right click and say copy. Or if you're comfortable with hotkeys, hold the control key and press C for copy. Once you've copied that, we'll go back into InDesign and we'll bring it in. So one of the most common ways to bring text into InDesign is to copy and paste it, but it must be pasted into a text box. Everything in InDesign exists in some kind of a frame or a box. So make sure you're on the text tool, or the type tool, sorry, and draw on page 2. Click and hold your mouse down and drag to draw a text box. When you let go, you'll see a blinking cursor and a blue border. Don't worry, the blue border wouldn't show up if you printed this or made a PDF out of it. It's just there so you can actually see the box. So with the blinking cursor blinking, if you hold the control key down and press V to paste the story that you've copied, it'll paste the entire story. Okay. You can also use edit paste. I don't recommend right click and pasting here because it can sometimes mistakenly create a new text box and confuse people. So we've got our entire story in one text box. What do you mean? Well, I'll explain it. So let's switch to the selection tool. Okay, we're switching. We've used the text tool or the type tool to create our first text box, and we pasted text into it. Now we're changing back to the selection tool, that black pointer on the top of the toolbar. So with this, if you single click to select the text box you've just created, this tool allows you to move a text box around. Okay, it allows you to grab the corner and resize it, and notice that the text will flow to fill whatever shape you choose for the text box, for the column. Okay, you can make it longer and you can make it shorter, but regardless of how big we make this column, our entire story doesn't fit, but we copied the entire story, and that's important to do that, and here's why. When you bring in a story or a chapter, you want them to you want the story to flow through multiple linked text boxes. You know, it's easier to just do it than to explain it. So let's just do it. So the entire story is here. And when an entire story is in a text box and you can't see it all, there'll be a little warning for you. This little plus in this little red square here This is a linkage handle, and it has to do with the relationship between text boxes. It'll turn red if the story you've pasted into the text box is too big for that text box. So if you single click on this, and remember we're on the selection tool, if you single click on this, it loads the continuation of the story into this text box, into the cursor. If you click and drag, I'm clicking and holding and dragging another text box, more story appears. Still have a red plus. Click again, drag another text box. Click and drag. There we go. Now we've got 3 text boxes, and look at that. The third text box, no more red plus. Now you will notice that there's a little blue arrowhead pointing to the right. That indicates that this is the first or one of many text boxes with the story continuing in the next box. So first, second, third, it takes 3 text boxes to show the whole story. If I make this one smaller, the text flows into the next text boxes, be they on this page or on pages much farther on in the magazine or the book or the publication. If I choose this middle text box and press delete, the story doesn't disappear. It doesn't go anywhere. You have less text boxes, but the story is still intact. You can't see it all, but it's still intact. And here's that red plus sign again that says you need more text boxes or bigger text boxes to show the whole story. Click on this one, draw another text box, and your story is back. So this is the power of InDesign, that you can bring in an entire story or an entire chapter or section in one copy and paste into one text box, and then create new text boxes from that original first text box to create linked text boxes. And then the story flows from one box into the other. And it's practically impossible to delete a part of your story by mistake. I'm back to one text box here just by pressing delete, and I can rebuild it again. No text is gone. I'm just clicking on the linkage handle and drawing more text boxes. You can do this on other pages, of course. If I delete this one, notice that the red linkage handle is returned. I could click to grab the rest of the story, drag down to this page or 100 pages into the future, and drag a new text box, and the story continues. Now, one of the great powers of this is that we now want to format this text. And to format the text, obviously we want to format the font size or the typeface or the look and style of this text throughout the entire story. And with linked text boxes, this is so easy. Okay, do this with me. If you single click in here, it selects the box. If you double click, notice that it automatically has switched you from the selection tool to the type tool. And now if you look closely, there's a blinking cursor in here, just like any other word processor. Okay? If you triple click, 1, 2, 3, it selects the entire sentence. If you do 4 clicks, 1, 2, 3, 4, it selects the entire paragraph. And if you do 5 clicks, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it selects the entire story, regardless of what page you're on, how many pages your story is on, and where these text boxes are. It doesn't matter what page they're on. The entire story, throughout all linked text boxes, gets selected. You can also just put the cursor in here and press Control A to select all. You don't have to select 5 times, but either will work. So it's super important to remember that this is how you bring in a section of your work or an entire story or article. Think of it like a chapter. If you want to bring in one chapter at a time, that's fine. But you never copy small sections of the same story into separate text boxes because this relationship will not exist. So the entire chapter, the entire article, the entire story, copy the whole thing in one time into one text box, and then create linked text boxes starting from the first one to create that relationship of one story linked throughout all those text boxes, and you never have to worry about losing a portion of your story, because if I delete this text box, the story's still there. It's just not all visible right now. And your linkage handle is there. Single click on that. And then wherever you want, draw another text box to continue the story. So now we're ready to format the text. Let's scroll back up to page 2 and 3, our first two text boxes here. Zoom in a little bit if you need to. Control plus, control key, push the plus key. Switch to the type tool, and you can put the cursor in there with a single click, and you could click 5 times, or you could put the cursor in there and press Control A to select all, like we talked about. With all the text selected, we can now go through and make changes that will apply to the entire story across all text boxes that are linked for this story. Okay, so we're in the Type tool. We're on the A button. Remember that if you click on the Paragraph button here, the little backwards P, you see Paragraph options, and the A is for Character options. So there's 2 sets of options related to text or typography. So we're on the A for Character options. First choice is, of course, font or typeface. So you can add whatever font you want here, or choose whatever you like. I'm going to go down to something like Tahoma, let's say. You might have a different set of fonts, of course, depending on your computer. Directly below the font choice is the selections for the font family, meaning variants like bold or italics. Remember that not all fonts have all of the variations available to you. A small font family means you might not have bold or italics. A large font family has a variety of options for different variants of the font. So we've just got regular and bold for the Tahoma font. Next to it, we have the font size. Often the default is a little big for a main body copy. So let's experiment with bringing this down. This is dependent on your font, but try something around 10 point. I'm using the nudge buttons, which is a little more control than just choosing from the list. You can nudge down in increments. You can also do variations like 10.5. You can do half points. Believe it or not, you can do that. But we can go with 10 for now. Right below it is the leading. Technically, it should be pronounced leading based on what the word comes from, but we can call it leading if you like. And we're going to use the nudge buttons for leading to increase the space between the lines. One of the things that makes smaller print and wider columns very readable is some decent amount of space between the lines. And the space between lines is called the leading or the leading. You can adjust that here. You have to select all the text you want to apply it to, of course. So with select all, you know that you've selected the text for all your story across all your text boxes that are linked, and you can make this leading option quite wide. That's of course too much for this look and style, so let's shrink it down. The default is often a little tight, so I like to put a little bit more breathing room in there. That's kind of nice. Moving on, we've got a bunch of very standard options for text. All caps is a way to make everything go all capitals. Might as well have a look at it. There's all capitals. Not a good idea for what we're doing here. Below it is small caps. We may use that in a little bit. It's a neat look, and we'll try that later on. These are the usual superscript and subscript options that you might be using for things like the 4th of July or the H2O. Those are superscript and subscript. And you've got underline and strike through. Pretty standard stuff if you've used Microsoft Word. The rest we'll probably leave until we talk about larger font sizes and working with more display font headings and larger font sizes. Let's flip over to the paragraph formatting controls. So switch to the paragraph formatting controls with the little backwards P here. And let's look at justification. I like this. This is good left justification. That's a clean edge here and a jagged right edge. But we have many options available to us. Selecting all again, we can choose center justification. That doesn't make any sense in this context. Right justification. It's creative, but it's not really ideal for reading large amounts of text. Second row has some interesting options, and here's probably my favorite one. Justify with the last line aligned left. If you choose that, what you get is full justification on both sides. And wherever there's some orphaned words on a line at the end of each paragraph, it leaves that alone. It keeps that on the left justification. The alternate is full justification. And this creates solid, clear blocks of text, very newspapery, and it can result in some strange anomalies like unusual amounts of space between words, as you can see over here. So let's leave this, select all again, and leave it on justify with the last line aligned left. Okay, good stuff. All right, let's take a second and talk about how InDesign thinks about paragraphs. How are paragraphs handled in this software? To understand how different this is from, say, Microsoft Word, I want you to put your cursor somewhere in the first paragraph. Just put it in there, say, in front of I have paid my dues, and press enter once. Well, that kind of looks like a paragraph. It does create a paragraph. It doesn't give you any space between the paragraph, but it does create a paragraph, and that's how a paragraph initially might look in InDesign. If you want another space in there, you could press enter again, and this would give you something like what you might be used to in other word processors. But this is not necessarily the best way to create space between your paragraphs. Paragraph spacing is an option that you can set. So I want you to press backspace once and backspace again to fix that. Okay. If someone sends you a Word document and it's got a lot of breaks in it, meaning they've pressed enter twice at the end of every paragraph, you could have unnecessary spaces like this throughout. You could have something that looks like this when you import it into InDesign, and it may not be what you want. You may often find yourself cleaning up the formatting of text that's given to you before you can do it strategically and more efficiently in InDesign. So often you may have to begin by cleaning up text that's sent to you from a writer or someone who's submitted or contributed content to your publication. So often you might want to get rid of those extra spaces. You don't want to get rid of your paragraph breaks because you want to know where the writer intended the paragraphs to be. But you don't need unnecessary spaces, and you'll want to clean those up carefully without erasing paragraphs. And then as we go forward with these next few choices, these next few options, you'll see that it's far more powerful to let InDesign format the paragraphs for you and get you a real clean and consistent look. Okay, so we're going to want to select all of the text. Control A gives me all of my paragraphs. It's important to be aware that if you don't select your entire story, any paragraph formatting you change only applies to the paragraph that the cursor is in when you make the changes. So always remember, select all if this is a change that should apply to all of the story, to all of the paragraphs. So we've done that. We've pressed Control A or done our 5 clicks to select the entire story. And don't forget, it selects the entire story regardless of how many pages your story is on. Okay, so we've got all our paragraphs selected. Let's look at this first one here. We're going to skip that first one there. The second one is called first line left indent. And this one will give us, with the nudge buttons, I highly recommend the nudge buttons. Don't try to figure out the appropriate numbers to type in here. Just use your nudge buttons and nudge in a little bit of paragraph indent. Okay, this looks a little bit more like what we're used to. We can see the paragraphs a little better. We know where they are. This is first line indent, which looks like the formatting you might be used to in a novel or sometimes in a textbook. Next, let's talk about the space between paragraphs. So put your cursor back in the text and select all again. Control A is your hotkey for that. And find this option. It's called space after. This is the option you use to put space between paragraphs. And this is what you do instead of pressing enter twice. Get rid of any extra enters or returns that are between paragraphs in the text when you copy it from Word, and instead apply a little bit of space after with this option. So it's right here. Use the nudge buttons and nudge in just a couple nudges of space between your paragraphs. This is too much. I don't like that. Let's choose Control A and nudge back down 1. Not bad. This is, of course, a matter of taste, personal creativity, but that's how you add space between paragraphs. Now, why is this so powerful? Why not just press enter twice? One of the beauties of this approach is that it's consistent. It applies the exact same settings and exact same adjustments across all your paragraphs. And when you create a new paragraph, such as putting a cursor in here and pressing enter, all those options just appear for you. The first line indent, the amount of space you want between paragraphs, it all applies. So this is powerful. It gives you a lot of control, and there's consistency when you do things this way for paragraph formatting.